right, thank you so much, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Free Speech and Hate Histories Lessons. My name is Jeff Martin, and I'm the president and co-founder of the Tulsa Literary Coalition and Magic City Books. I am also proud to say I'm the chapter leader for Tulsa's PEN Across America chapter here. PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. We are a 100-year-old organization that champions the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Our mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. Our strength is our membership, a nationwide community of novelists, journalists, nonfiction writers, editors, poets, essayists, playwrights, publishers, translators, scholars, and other writing professionals, as well as devoted readers and supporters who join with them to carry out PEN America's mission. And you can find out more about events like this, advocacy efforts, and about joining PEN America at pen.org. We hope you will. Today's event is the sixth and final in a year-long series entitled Flashpoints: Free Speech in American History, Culture, and Society. The series is presented by PEN America in partnership with the American Historical Association and made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The series is timed to mark PEN's 100th anniversary. In addition to the live events, videos from previous events and digital resources will be available to educators and the public for years to come. We are, of course, filming tonight's event as well, and that will be made public later on as well. We're thrilled that you're able to join us tonight for this evening for what I know will be an engaging and robust conversation about speech in American history. And we are grateful to our moderator, Dr. Carlos Hill, and our panelists, Randall Kennedy and Jennifer Ho. Let's give them a warm welcome. Just like that. A bit about our moderator tonight. Dr. Carlos K. Hill is advisor to the President for Community Engagement and Regents Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He is also a proud affiliate faculty in the OU History Department at Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israeli Studies. Dr. Hill is the author of 3 books: Beyond the Rope, The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory, The Murder of Emmett Till, A Graphic History, and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, a photographic history. Dr. Hill founded the Tulsa Race Massacre Oklahoma Teachers Institute to support teaching the history of the race massacre to thousands of middle school and high school students. Something that's quite needed in our community right now, so thank you for that. He currently writes a series for The Nation magazine featuring the stories and the work of community activists organizing for justice in Black communities. We'll get to our conversation in just a moment, but before our panel begins, I would like to introduce Victor Lukerson, who will be reading from his January 2021 essay, Living in the Age of the White Mob. And just so you're all in the know, Victor's long-awaited and highly anticipated debut book, Built from the Fire, the epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood District, America's Black Wall Street, comes out on May 23rd. Victor Lukerson, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to PEN America, the Tulsa Press Club, OU Tulsa, and Magic City Books for hosting this event. I'm going to be reading an essay I wrote for The New Yorker on January 15th, 2021. It was written after I was watching the Capitol riot from my home here in Tulsa on January 6th. And I'm usually a pretty objective journalist. My job is to go tell stories, talk to people, report them back to the world. But I felt motivated to write something about how I felt about what happened then. And I think with this event being about free speech and how that can be corrupted, the First Amendment is near and dear to my heart as a journalist, but sort of seeing how that was warped on that day really spoke to me. So I wrote this for The New Yorker, and I'm going to read an adaptation of what was published then. Living in the age of the white mob. For most of the century and a half since the Civil War, white mobs have had free reign over American society. They burned Black schools during Reconstruction, strung Black bodies from trees during the lynching era, and harassed Black students during the Civil Rights Movement. These were acts of racism, but they were also flexes of political power. The mob always demands that its agenda reign forever, or else be replaced by death and chaos. The white mob exists outside of American mythology, but it has long shaped the nation's reality. Consider Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a group of armed whites destroyed the city's thriving black business district in 1921, burning 35 square blocks and killing as many as 300 people. It has been a century since the Tulsa Race Massacre, and still, when people learn about it, they express shock, as if it is a surprising outlier, as if, in the same time period, white mobs did not terrorize Rosewood, Florida, and Elaine, Arkansas, and East St. Louis, Illinois. Members of white mobs do not have to mask their faces. They do not need the protection of a conspiracy of silence. Being part of a white mob has rarely been a crime. These tactics, when adopted, are done to instill fear, but also for pleasure and excitement. During the Tulsa Race Massacre, rioters took pictures in front of the burning buildings and collected postcards of the carnage. If Facebook Live and selfie sticks had existed, members of the mob would have live-streamed their destruction to the world back then, too. White mobs may embarrass some of their social betters, but that disagreement is more over appearance than ideology. The Tulsa World in 1921 saw the race massacre as a branding problem and argued for restoring Greenwood, quote, not because of affectionate regard for the colored man, but for the white race whose boast of superiority must now be justified. On January 6th, as Donald Trump watched the mob storm the Capitol, he reportedly complained that the rioters looked, quote, low class. A white mob views itself as an extension of the law, not a repudiation of it. The Ku Klux Klan reemerged in the 1920s as an insurgency against the crime and immorality that it said gripped the nation. In Oklahoma, its ranks include many members of the white elite: judges, doctors, police commissioners. They intended to help preserve, quote, law and order. This mindset explains how a crowd brandishing pro-police flags could mutate into a violent mob at the Capitol that attacked and injured cops, killing one officer. You should be on our side, a Trump supporter told the police outside the Capitol. We the people means police, too. In the years before the election of President Trump, the white mob was most often portrayed as a historical artifact, trapped in unnerving black and white photographs of a bygone era. But the mob never really left the places where it had taken root. In 1956, at my alma mater, the University of Alabama, a white mob chased the first black student, authoring Lucy, around campus, trapping her in the library after peppering her with rotten eggs. Lucy was still alive until last year. In 2015, at the University of Oklahoma, which is located in the former sundown town of Norman, white fraternity students sang in a recorded video, quote, you can hang it from a tree, but it'll never sound with me. There will never be a nigger at SAE. For some white people, being part of a white mob is the equivalent of a rebellious teenage phase. The white mob's work is political, advancing the white agenda in ways the courts and elections cannot. After committing acts of terror, its members go on about their lives. They bear no life-defining scarlet letter. Recently, I talked to a man named Mark Celeste, who believes that his grandfather, Benjamin Fowler, participated in the Tulsa Race Massacre. Celeste condemns the act of the mob and believes events of the massacre should be more widely known, but he doesn't personally feel ashamed over his grandfather's role. I'll be honest with you, he told me. I heard about it then, and then just sort of vaguely cataloged it in my mind. Unless something specifically spurs you, it's not going to be thought of. The white mob is a criminal conspiracy with no criminals, a historical menace floating outside popular history, a flouting of American ideals draped in the American flag. Despite the stomach-churning similarities, 2021 is not 1921. The white mob is not turning against the state, threatening the lives of elected officials, desecrating their sacred chambers, and attacking police officers, because the state has failed to uphold its end of the power-hungry mob's bargain. For more than a century, Black people have argued that mob lawlessness is a threat to their communities, but also to democratic society as a whole. Mob law is dangerous and will undermine the foundations of any government that permits it, warned Greenwood's black newspaper, the Tulsa Star, in 1915. Unless this monster is subdued in this country, serious trouble is sure to follow. Now we will see whether white people choose to listen, and federal prosecutors will play a key role in forcing them to hear. Blame for participating in or inciting a mob should be applied to individual actors based on evidence, with criminal punishments that aim to deter future mob activity. To blame violence on general social ills or cultural divisions is to hand wave away the problem, as white Tulsans did after the race massacre. After the January 6th insurrection, Representative Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma told the Tulsa World, quote, "No one is to blame here. We are all to blame." He laid fault for the insurrection on Democrats, Republicans, journalists, and people on social media, but not President Trump. Most critically, the core grievances of the mob must be rejected because they are specious. The Tulsa race massacre was sparked by a false rape allegation, which was propped up by a sensational newspaper account. Today, people like Senator James Langford, who served on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, should see the danger in stoking false public fears that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. At the exact moment that the Capitol was breached, Langford was on the Senate floor, defending his planned vote to object to the election results. After witnessing the intensity of a white mob firsthand, Langford switched his vote, but he hedged. He insisted that election security was an important issue that needs to be resolved, despite the fact that officials in all 50 states and more than 80 judges certified the accuracy of the 2020 election. Mealy-mouthed ambiguity about whether democracy has or hasn't been subverted is oxygen that allows a white mob to rage and to feel righteous about it. Throughout the American history, the white mob has expressed the will of large portions of the white populace. So it is today. 45% of Republicans say they supported the Capitol siege, according to a YouGov poll. We live in a country that gestures towards egalitarianism, but ultimately, white people retain the money, the leverage of government, and the raw power. The white mob is a reminder of this plain fact, which lingers in the national psyche long after the mob's specific actions have been scrubbed from living memory. The white mob persists in part because it is not a source of national shame, nor of many people's personal shame. The authors of American Dogma left white mobs out when they taught us historical parables of good and evil as children. Now some ask us as adults to brush aside the mob's actions and believe in democracy. Until we reckon with the historical and modern truth of white mob violence, its presence cannot be cleaved from the nation's identity. Until then, the white mob will always be with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor, for grounding this conversation before I even start as moderator. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for being here today to hear this really important conversation on free speech and hate speech. I'm Dr. Carlos Hill. I'm going to introduce my esteemed panelists, Jennifer Holt, as well as Randall Kennedy, in just a second. But I really want to make sure that I thank the appropriate people today, because this is, again, a very, very urgent conversation with some really esteemed scholars. And so I really want to thank PEN America. I want to thank also the American Historical Association and all the other partners who've made this event possible. Certainly I want to thank Christine and Layla for making this a really wonderful experience for me as a moderator, helping me to understand the significance, the urgency of this conversation and all the conversations that have happened as a part of this series this year. So thank you for inviting me into this conversation today. I really want to continue to do the work that Victor began to do, trying to lay groundwork for making sense of and thinking about the gravity of this conversation, particularly the gravity of this conversation in Tulsa, particularly if we're going to have an embodied conversation about free speech and hate speech. I think we have to ground the conversation in the ways that Victor is helping us to understand, and I want to try to reinforce. I stand before you as, a Black Studies professor that teaches in the Claire Luper Department of African and African American Studies, and I smile because it's it makes me proud to be a part of that department and to have had a hand in the naming of that department in honor of Clara Luper, a historic civil rights activist that many people don't know, but should, who transformed a sit-in movement into what we call Freedom's Classroom. And I'm so excited for her book to be republished in July of 2023, Clara Luper's Behold the Walls. And so one of the great joys of my career is to have been chair of that department and have helped to name that department in our honor. And I've come to say to people now, having become very close with the family, that I bear witness to the life and legacy of Clara Luper, because she's been that transformative, not just for Oklahoma City, but we have begun to argue America. And so I say all that to say that it's really important for me to ground who I am in this conversation, not have a disembodied conversation without sharing that. I would also say I'm a historian of lynching and racial violence. And I spent my career trying to explain the gravitas of the lynching era to people, but now what I try to tell audiences, I try to bear witness to the 400 years of salt, right? I try to reference the 1619 Project, the 400 years of salt on Black people and Black bodies. I try to, as much as I can, as Victor's tried to lay out to you, that felt history of the Black experience. And so what I would say to you, in addition to what Victor has said about the race massacre, I'll say just in short that when we think about the history of hate in America, we should all be very cautious in a conversation about should the right of free speech extend to hateful expression. When you know the history of racial violence in our country, you should be cautious. We should be cautious how we answer that question. And certainly in a city like Tulsa with a history, right, of the deadliest assault on a Black community in American history, we need to be very, very cautious how we answer that question and how we ground our responses to that question, right? If we're going to do it in honor of what I try to center in my scholarship, victims, survivors, and descendants of America's 400 years of assault on Black people and Black body. And so I say that to ground you in the conversation that I would like to have, in addition to the conversation that my panelists, Randall Kennedy, and my esteemed panelist, Jennifer Ho, they're going to provide yet other lenses to understand, right, this really critical issue, this really critical question of free speech, freedom of expression, right? And to what degree should hate speech, the right to hateful speech, be a part of that speech, right? That's the conversation that we're going to have. And so it's my profound, and I want to really emphasize that profound honor to introduce my colleagues. Professor Kennedy is Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He served as a law clerk for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Courts of Appeal and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. He is a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and the Supreme Court of the United States. Awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law, Professor Kennedy writes a wide range of scholarly as well as general interest publications. Mr. Randall Kennedy, I want to begin with you. You are first up, and I know you want to stand at the lectern, so I want to give you some time to get there. But I want to ask you the first question, and I'm going to sit down. But it's a question that really brings into direct contrast this question. The film Birth of a Nation has been controversial for 100 years, similar to the 1921 race massacre. Can you share with us the attempts to censor Birth of a Nation and why it is important to the history of free speech in this country?
Sure. Can I be heard by everyone? Okay, is that better? Great. Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and I'd like to thank all who've made this forum available to me and my colleague and available to all of us. And I'm going to answer directly your question about Birth of a Nation. Let me just give a little bit of a prelude. For much of American history, champions of free expression and racial justice have marched together arm in arm, arrayed against white supremacists who were altogether happy to use force, including state power, to silence their foes. The dearth of power available to those challenging white supremacy relieved them of having to consider whether they should seek to censor racist expression. So during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, African Americans and those sympathetic to their plight as racial subordinates were almost wholly the ones on the receiving end of governmental and private repression. That changed somewhat in the 20th century when Black activists and their allies tried, sometimes successfully, to silence racist propaganda. In controversies that mirrored both the continuing oppression of Blacks and their enhanced status in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, reformers who considered themselves protectors of the African American racial reputation attempted to censor those understood as defaming the American Negro. And a classic example of this has to do with Birth of a Nation. So first of all, what was Birth of a Nation? Birth of a Nation was a film that was first unveiled in 1915. And it was a film that was the most expensive, the most profitable, the most ambitious, the most innovative and controversial film of its time. It was the first blockbuster. It was the first film to be shown in the White House. It was an extraordinary film in American filmmaking and indeed in international filmmaking. It is generally viewed as one of the great feats of filmmaking in history. It was also a profoundly racist film. It was a film that dramatized Reconstruction and the way that D.W. Griffith, the director of the film, the way that he viewed Reconstruction was as follows. He viewed Reconstruction as a tragedy. The film shows the emergence of Blacks, particularly Black men, as participants in government as being just a terrible thing. And in fact, one of the more vivid episodes in the film shows Black people in a legislature, and they're doing things. They're throwing chicken bones. They have their feet on the table. They're picking their toes. They're made to look like ignorant brutes. The heroes of Birth of a Nation, the heroes of Birth of a Nation are the Ku Klux Klan, because the Ku Klux Klan rides in and redeems the White South and brings order, brings virtue back. That's Birth of a Nation. Now, many of the leading racial justice activists of that time, remember what I said, 1915. Many of the leading racial justice activists wanted to ban Birth of a Nation. So let's listen for a moment to James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson was a great poet. James Weldon Johnson was the person who wrote what is often referred to as the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. James Weldon Johnson was the first Black person to actually be the executive secretary of the NAACP. Absolutely remarkable person. And what did James Weldon Johnson say? James Weldon Johnson decried Birth of a Nation as a, quote, hell-inspired production, a stupendous moving picture play that seriously attempts to hold the American Negro up before the whole country as a degraded brute. James Weldon Johnson wanted Birth of a Nation to be banned. He hinted that he might be satisfied with just excising some of the most objectionable parts of the film. But what he really wanted was for the film to be banned altogether. He wasn't alone. I'll mention another character whom I revere, W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois publicly supported the banning of Birth of a Nation. Du Bois, though, is an interesting figure in this drama because he expressed some ambivalence in his private discussions with other colleagues in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He said that the fight against Birth of a Nation illustrates the peculiar contradiction into which the Negro problem forces this organization, namely the NAACP. So the NAACP stands for liberty, physical liberty, political liberty, and particularly liberty in artistic expression. So he said, that's what the NAACP stands for. But here he was arguing that this film ought to be banned. And he justified that on the grounds that this film was what he viewed a special case. He said that this was a case in which the greatest master of the new art of cinema has sensationalized the purported sexual crimes of Black men and instigated resort to vigilante violence. A new art was used deliberately to slander and vilify a race. And he viewed this as a special encroachment, a special challenge. And he ended his comments by saying that this was a case involving not art, but vicious propaganda. Du Bois recognized that it is dangerous to limit expression, but he also maintained that without some limitation, civilization could not endure, and that Birth of a Nation exceeded the bounds of toleration. So here you have a situation in which you have this film, which everybody recognizes to be, a pretty extraordinary artistic venture. But you also have the NAACP recognizing this film as an instance of racist propaganda. So the NAACP and other racial reformers tried to ban the film. Well, what happened? They were successful in some places. So, for instance, they got the film banned in St. Louis. They got the film banned in New Haven, Atlantic City. They got the film banned in the state of Ohio. The censorship board of Ohio banned the film. The film was banned in Kansas. the sitting Kansas governor happened to be a member of the NAACP, and he made it so that the film could not be shown in the state of Kansas. So there's 2 states and a series of cities in which Birth of a Nation was banned. The NAACP tried to get it banned in other places, but largely failed. Largely failed in cities, largely failed in states, largely failed in with respect to congressional action. Now, what does one say about this? I view this. I think for me, it's a difficult case. It's a difficult case because, again, the people who wanted this film banned were quite substantial figures. They were artists in their own right. They were free-thinking individuals who typically were champions of freedom of expression. In this case, they were against it, and they wanted to put limits on freedom of expression. And so how do I view this? I look back on the effort to censor Birth of a Nation with a paradoxical set of impressions. I'm glad that dissident intellectual activists whom I revere, people like Du Bois, people like James Weldon Johnson, people like Charles Chestnut, I'm glad that they largely failed to enlist government in their effort to expunge Birth of a Nation. Why do I say that? I say that because my freedom to write at this very moment, my freedom to speak at this very moment, is enhanced to some degree by the habitual defense of freedom of expression that was strengthened by the struggle to reject the expungement of Birth of a Nation. So, the struggle over that evil film, is part of the history that has strengthened a habit in the United States, in my view, a very good habit in the United States, a habit to embrace freedom of expression, and a habit that that leads people to be very skeptical, very suspicious of governmental efforts to shut people up, even when people are saying terrible things. Now, it wasn't just good ideas. It wasn't just a love of freedom of expression that played an important role in the defense of Birth of a Nation. Racism played an important role in the defense of Birth of a Nation too, and that has to be acknowledged. But uplifting sentiments, again, the defense of freedom of expression did play an important role. And the fact that, that fact accentuates the complexities, ironies, and contradictions that typically attend human affairs. So in looking back on this flashpoint for me, I'm conflicted, but ultimately I'm happy that Birth of a Nation was, to a very large extent, allowed to play, and that actually in our world, Birth of a Nation, you can watch it anytime you want. Go to YouTube, you can watch it, you can see it. And I'm glad that you can see it. And I think that the forces that make Birth of a Nation available to us, they have a cost. There's a price for that. But in my view, it's a price worth paying. Thank you very much.
Professor Kennedy, thank you so much for that reflection and putting into context Birth of a Nation, both in terms of the impact that it had on activism, but also the struggle over freedom of expression. I want to turn, I lost I lost you for a second. I did lose you there. I want to turn to my next esteemed panelist, Professor Jennifer Ho, who is director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts and professor of ethnic studies, where she teaches courses on Asian American culture and critical race theory, and this is at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She is past president of the Association for Asian American Studies, 2020 and 2022, and author of 2 co-edited essay collections, Teaching Approaches to Asian North American Literature and Narratives of Race and Ethnicity in the United States. In addition to her academic work, Jennifer Ho is active in community engagement around issues of race, intersectionality, as well as leading workshops on anti-racism, and specifically on how to talk about race. And this is what I teach so much to my students, how to talk about race and racism in our current political climate. Professor Jennifer Ho, in 2017, the Supreme Court heard the case Matal v. Tam, in which the Portland, Oregon Asian American dance rock band, the Slants, filed for a federal trademark of their name, were initially denied because of their name. Their name was disparaging and offensive according to the 1946 Lanham Act. Can you speak to, for us, about this case and what we can maybe glean from it in terms of the context that's been laid by Professor Kennedy in terms of what it means to reclaim a racial slur and why someone should feel maybe cautious about reclaiming racial slurs as trademarks, if you could speak to that.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Just out of curiosity, how many people have even heard of Matal versus Tam? A few. Not many. So the 2 things before I begin my specific remarks. One is that I think it's important for you to know that in terms of my professional expertise, I also come as the daughter of a refugee father from China and an immigrant mother from Jamaica. And my grandparents were themselves immigrants from Hong Kong to Kingston, Jamaica. And I want to begin there because I feel like my personal identity as a Chinese, Jamaican, Asian American woman has a bearing on the things that I believe my professional, my academic life. I direct an Arts and Humanities Center. So I think it's also important for me to play some music for you because Tam himself was always really bothered by the interviews he did with news organizations in which what he wanted was to be a musician. He is a musician. And in the lead up to the Supreme Court case, he'd get interviewed all the time and he was trying to say, this is my music, but people were just focused on the Supreme Court case. So I feel like, you need to hear the music, right? Okay, let's see if this will work.
I'm feeling like a catch right now. Believing anything is possible. Since I lay my eyes on you, I've got the move.
Okay. If anybody is around my age, and let me just say, New Order, The Cure, Depeche Mode, this is the sound that the Slants are aiming for. What Tam has called Chinatown dance music. So what happened was he saw the film Kill Bill by Quentin Tarantino. Some people know that film? Okay. So he sees the film Kill Bill, and there's a scene where Lucy Liu is, she's the head of this, Yakuza mob, and she's walking kind of in slow-mo, about to face Uma Thurman. By the way, I don't know the names of any of the characters. I just know who the actresses are. And so Tam is watching this, and he's seeing Asian American cool for the first time in a mainstream film. And he thinks, oh, this is what I want, right? This is the thing I've been looking for. Asian Americans being represented, not in terms of, a threat like Yellow Peril or a model minority, but, like with swag, right? With swagger. So he thinks to himself, okay, I'm going to form a band. That's, of course, the natural response to wanting Asian American swagger is that you're going to form a band. So, he decides to be a bassist. He puts out a call. And, his intent is to find Asian American musicians. He's not quite successful in the first iteration. He's got 4, there's 6 of them, 4 of them are Asian American identified, 2 are not. Then he thinks, okay, what is a name for an Asian American band? What do Asian Americans have in common? And he polls his friends. Now, this is interesting, right? And his friends say, Asians have slanted eyes. And he thinks to himself, well, that's not true, right? Asians, this is a stereotype, right? Asians do not have slanted eyes. But it sticks with him, right? He thinks, well, the word slant is an interesting word, right? Slant can have, slant means bias, slant means perspective. And so he decides, okay, I'm gonna name my band, my cool Chinatown dance music band, Depeche Mode like the Slants, as a way to reclaim the name. As a way to say, and he also talks about being bullied, growing up and being bullied for being Asian American, and having, like, he recounts one incident where, and he's, Chinese American, where somebody was like calling him a Jap or a gook, and he ends up yelling at his tormentors and saying, I'm a chink, I'm not a gook, right? So kind of using humor, right? Kind of using hate language. And so he decides, okay, I'm going to reclaim this name. Now, a couple of things, right? I have definitely had the word slant or slanted as an adjective applied to all sorts of nouns when being directed at me in terms of a racial epithet. But in general, the word slant in of itself isn't really, I would say, a racial slur used against Asian Americans. Yes, this is where I'm being the pedantic English professor, right? Yes, in its adjectival form, less in a noun form, okay? But I understand his intent. His intent is, here's a word that has been used as a slur against Asians in America, and I want to try and reappropriate it. I want to try and reclaim it. So, believe it or not, there's actually more than one band named the Slants. And someone gets confused and goes to the other band and doesn't get to see them. And so, his friend is an attorney, says you should trademark the name. So in 2009, he applies for a trademark. And there's a problem, right? It's denied. And it's denied based on something called the Lanham Act. We'll see how many trademark lawyers in the room. How many people know what the Lanham Act is? Right. Okay, 1. Great. Okay, so Section 2A of the Lanham Act, by the way, I researched for today, right? Section 2A of the Lanham Act actually has something that's known as the disparagement clause. The Lanham Act has been around since 1946. And the disparagement clause basically says you can't have a trademark that is going to disparage a group of people. The technical language is persons, but persons, group of people. So the attorney who's reviewing the application actually looks them up, looks up the Slants, right? Finds their website, sees that they're Asian American, and then realizes that, and sees they're very intentional, right? On their website, they talk about how this is an act of reappropriation. This is an act of reclamation. Very similar to the way that LGBTQ plus people have tried to reclaim, and I think have successfully reclaimed the word queer from being a pejorative to being a term of pride. So the patent office, right, the patent and trademark office, the PTO, basically says, well, slant in this case is intentionally being invoked as a racial epithet, as a derogative. And so, no, the application on the basis of the Lanham Act and the disparagement clause is denied. And specifically, and I have the quote here, what they say is the applicant is a founding member of a band that is self-described as being composed of members of Asian descent. The association of the term slants with those of Asian descent is evidenced by how applicant uses the mark as the name of an all Asian American band of which he, an Asian, is a member. And essentially what they're saying is that if he had been white, right, or non-Asian and used the word slant, it would be approved. Because in this particular case, the disparagement rested entirely on the body of Tam and the band members being Asian and invoking it, right? Because the word slant, of course, can mean a number of different things. So this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it gets a lot of attention actually in 2017, because what's happened in 2014 is that the Washington Commanders, or does anyone remember the name of the original name of Washington Commanders, right? The Washington Redskins, yeah. So they had 6 of their trademarks pulled because of this disparagement clause, and they had a case going up to the Supreme Court. So they were watching, the Washington Redskins were watching really carefully. Tam actually joked that, and in interviews, they kept asking him about the Redskins, and he was always really careful about a couple things. He also joked that he wouldn't mind some Redskins money, right, to help him with his legal case, because even though his lawyer was working pro bono, he still racked up thousands and thousands of dollars of debt in taking this case all the way to the Supreme Court. So what Tam said, and I think this is worth noting, I think context is really important, right? That what he was trying to do as a Chinese American, Asian American man that was part of an Asian American band was reclaim a racial slur, right? Was reappropriate a part of racial hate speech. What the Washington Redskins were doing as non-American Indian identified people, right? Certainly the owner, I don't think, is American Indian identified. I don't know that any of the coaches, any of the players have ever been strongly, Indian American identified. And even, let me just say this, even if the entire team and owners had been American Indian identified, it would still be a slur. Because that's the thing, right? There's the identity of the people, and then there's the actual system in place of anti-Native American, anti-Asian, white supremacy. That is an ideology that needs to be addressed. So getting back to Tam, he argues, they argued this in front of the Supreme Court, and actually in a really interesting move, and this is 2017, right? This is the 8 of the 9 justices. Gorsuch had just gotten on the bench, so he wasn't part of listening to any of the oral arguments, or, he wasn't part of any of the decisions. So in a unanimous 8-0 vote, the justices actually agree that the disparagement clause is actually in violation of free speech. And what they are basically saying is that, and again, I want to make sure I get this right. Come on, iPad. Okay. And I cannot believe I'm going to quote Justice Alito, who wrote yeah, you can all guess my politics. Alito says that the PTO refused to register the slants because the PTO found the term disparaging to Asian Americans in the context of an all Asian American rock band. But the PTO has already registered White Trash Cowboys and Off-White Trash for 2 all-white rock bands, and registered NWA, an acronym that includes a racial slur against African Americans for an all-African American rap group. Speech may not be banned on the ground that it expresses ideas that offend. And this is viewpoint discrimination, right? This is what all the justices agree is viewpoint discrimination. And so Tam and the slants win. They also stopped playing. And that could be for a variety of reasons. 2019 was their last live show in Portland, Oregon. And after 2017, Tam went on to write a book, How an Asian American Troublemaker Took on the Supreme Court. And the band started a foundation, the Slants, to promote arts and activism. So why did I pick this case to talk about? First of all, unlike my esteemed colleague, I am not a legal scholar. I'm an Asian American studies scholar. And I wanted to find a case of hate speech that did involve, in the First Amendment, that involved Asian Americans. And this is a recent one. I also wanted to really think about what my commitment is to free speech in the First Amendment, because I have to admit that if I changed a few elements, I'd be really uncomfortable, right? So first of all, the word slant doesn't bother me. It's not, again, as I mentioned, it's usually, if it's been used against me, it's been used in an adjectival form. And I'm just going to say, I've already said it once, so I'll just say it again. And a word that would really trouble me to hear again and again is the word chink. You know, and that is a word that has been leveled against me as a form of hate speech from one of my earliest memories, right? I have this early memory of like flying a kite with my dad on a baseball mound when I was like maybe 4 or 5, and young white teenager kept kind of leaping at us, and he had like a knife apparently, and he wanted to cut the kite, and my dad yelled at him, and then he called us chinks. And, you know, that was something that I've learned was, you know, like that was sort of a first memory of learning, like, oh, this is what a slur is, right? This is what hate speech is. This is what it means to be targeted. So, you know, this particular, so if it was that word, would I be feeling differently, right? When I have such charged feelings and emotions about that particular word. If this was an all-white group, would I feel differently, right? If this was, and you know, a group that was called the Kung Flu, because I heard that phrase used a lot during COVID-19 and the rise of anti-Asian racism, would I be feeling differently? Yeah, I think I would, right? Would it change my mind about the First Amendment? Probably not. And that's the thing. That's the thing that I remind myself about, is that there's the feelings I have about all of this, about the way that white supremacy has undergirded the United States, the way that settler colonialism has undergirded the United States, the way that my family in particular has been impacted by anti-Asian racism. And there is the right that I have as a first generation college student whose grandmother on both sides of my family, you know, had like middle school educations, right? And I'm sitting next to Randall Kennedy talking to you about all of this. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And I am very grateful that I have the freedom of speech. Thank you.
And I have the wonderful privilege of being the moderator for these two amazing minds thinking about this question. And I want to remind us of the question that we started with, that we want to consider, which is, should the right of free speech extend to the right to hateful expression, right? And to what extent should it? Right? And I think in so many ways, Jennifer, as well as you, Professor Kennedy, really help us to understand the complexities of this, how difficult it is. And it's really about what you helped me to understand. It's really about your relationship to the word. Someone may have a different relationship to the word than you, and that word is unacceptable. But there are words that you have a relationship, right, that are unacceptable. So it transforms the relationship you have to the word, transforms how you think about this debate about hateful expression and what is and what isn't acceptable, particularly when we're thinking about what those words entail, the trauma that it tells, the cost that it tells. And Professor Kennedy, that's where you really helped, I think, in this conversation, as well as Victor, in terms of thinking about the cost. And you began by talking about the racism and the segregation and the oppression and the cost, but you were sure to remind us that the sacred sort of principle needs to be made intact, even with the ways in which it denigrated, it created and perpetuated some of the most abysmal stereotypes of Black people. It's still in all, you would argue that it should be, the film should not be banned, because it in many ways allows us to have this debate about free speech, and it allows us to, at the same time, give us an opportunity to criticize and to put it into context like we're doing tonight. And so what I would love to do is to try to put both of you in conversation. If I've understood the ways in which you've laid out your ways of thinking about this issue, the complexity in which you're thinking about this issue, I just want to give you a chance to respond, Jennifer, maybe first, or Professor Kennedy to respond after you to what he said and what I've said, because I think we're in conversation. We're speaking in many ways the same language.
Yeah, I am really uncomfortable with hate speech. Let's just call it hate speech. But I debate it. It's an active debate I have. I think the mantra of the First Amendment, of proponents of the First Amendment and free speech is that more speech is better. And I, for most of my academic career, have agreed with that. I do think social media, I wonder about social media and whether that's actually true. And I say that as someone who, to this day, I get weekly hate mail. I'm on the professor's watch list. I've joined a service called Delete Me that scrubs my personal identity from the internet. I've gotten a fair amount of threats. Not yet, knock on wood, not yet death threats, but I get rape threats. I get a lot of other really nasty things. And so, that makes me fearful. Right? Sometimes it makes me anxious to do public facing work. And so while I want to say, especially for my students, that of course they are free to say what they want to say and think what they want to say. And my job is to try and teach them, right? Teach them to think critically, present the information, show them history. Personally, it makes me really uncomfortable. Yeah.
And so what Jennifer really helps make clear is that when we start to think about the cost of hateful speech, right, it's borne disproportionately on people of color, right, who have voices of justice, who are fighting for change. The harm and the trauma of hate speech is borne on individuals like Jennifer Ho more than, say, other Americans. And so when we are having this conversation about free speech and hate speech, let's make sure we're texturing that, right, with the social realities, right, and the political realities of how hate speech actually is enacted in America, right, and who it's enacted upon, right, and who has the privilege of not, right, experiencing the kinds of things that Professor Ho has just mentioned. So for me, those are the stakes, right, that we have to constantly keep, right, in focus. We can't if we're going to have an embodied conversation about this, we have to keep those things in focus. And so I really would love, Professor Kennedy, if you could respond to Professor Ho, as well as kind of what I've said about this issue in light of your comments.
Sure. So a couple points I'd like to make. One, I don't think I ever, in my initial comments, gave a straightforward answer to the question, well, why not ban Birth of a Nation? If it's vilifying a race of people. And let's remember, again, this was 1915. In 1915, there were a substantial number of lynchings. We're talking about a time, 1915, 1916, 1917. In Tuskegee, they're keeping records on lynching. And in fact, one of the reasons why Du Bois and Chestnut and James Weldon Johnson, one of their arguments was, this isn't just something that is singeing our sensibilities. We are afraid that this film will actually instigate racial violence. That was sort of what was behind their campaign. So, question, why not go there? Why not allow such a film to be banned? Well, then one has to ask the question, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it, and by what standard are they going to do it? Now, there were a couple of places, like I indicated, where the film was banned. And, what were the standards? The standard was basically the chief of police or the mayor didn't like the film or thought that the film was bad. Well, question, do we want to empower government officials to ban things that they don't, that they think are awful? Well, do we? I don't. I don't want to do that. And in fact, you have to make some tough choices. I'll take Birth of a Nation over giving officialdom the power to say, no for this film, but yes for this film. Second of all, with respect to hateful expression, we're talking about this issue at a particular moment. We're talking about this issue at a moment at which in a substantial number of states, there has been legislation passed saying that certain things cannot be taught. There is a campaign against, for instance, critical race theory. What do the people who want to expunge critical race theory say? They say that critical race theory is hate speech. Now, I don't think it's hate speech, but they think it's hate speech. Well, if you have opened up the door to the government getting rid of hate speech, what does one do when one says, well, critical race theory is hate speech? All sorts of things can be viewed as hate speech. And so, I want to lean over backwards to prevent those with power to be able to marginalize, to be able to ban things. Because after all, who are the people in power? Racial minorities are typically not going to be the people in power. And by the way, when the deal goes down, when you ask, well, who actually was banned? Over and over and over again, when the deal goes down, it's going to be racial minority people. It's not going to be it's not going to be the Ku Klux Klan. No, it's going to be the Nation of Islam. That happens over and over and over. And so it's for that reason why I embrace the position taken by, among others, the American Civil Liberties Union or the National Committee Against Censorship. It's why I ultimately embrace the teachings that have been bequeathed to us by liberals who basically champion a libertarian ideology if we're talking about freedom of expression.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So we're in the state of Oklahoma, and my center recently hosted a speaker, Jennifer Holland, who's written a book called Tiny U about the anti-abortion movement in the U.S. West. And one of the things that she was telling me, and she teaches at the University of Oklahoma, is that there is some law that passed, and I don't think I'm going to be in violation of it because both I'm not a University of Oklahoma professor and I'm not in a classroom space. But what she told me was that in the classroom, if she were to simply say what states abortion was legal. So for example, I live in the state of Colorado and abortion is legal. If she were to say that right before a student said, I'm seeking an abortion, and she simply stated the fact that abortion is legal in the state of Colorado, she would be in violation of, does anyone know about this? She'd be in violation of some kind of Oklahoma law. Okay, so why isn't that protected by free speech, right? If she said, because I said, you're just simply saying, here are the states in which abortion is legal. You are giving a fact. You're not actually saying, here's how to obtain an abortion. Here's how to get a subscription to misoprostol, right? You're just simply saying, like, abortion is legal in the state of Colorado. Why isn't that protected as free speech?
Maybe it is. I mean, we don't know. It may very well be. Let's suppose. Let's take your hypo.
Okay.
And let's
Yeah.
make, let's go with your hypo, and let's suppose that some action is taken against this teacher, and that will end up in court, and it may very well be that if an action is taken against her, let's suppose that she's prosecuted, or let's suppose that she's dismissed or something. It may very well be that a judgment will be made that this is protected, and that no action should be taken against her. So that's point number one. Number two, the First Amendment has come up a bunch of times in our discussion. Now, I think the First Amendment, I like the First Amendment. But, the First Amendment, people actually have broadened it in a way that is somewhat misleading. The First Amendment the First Amendment protects people against governmental action. That's all. There's a lot of private action that's very powerful, that's very coercive. First Amendment doesn't protect you against that. So, for instance, let's suppose that you work for a private employer, and the employer says, I don't like what you said, get out of here. First Amendment doesn't have anything to say about that. So, people ought to recognize the First Amendment. It's an important device, but it's not all important. It is a protection against certain forms of governmental action. And another thing about the First Amendment, the First Amendment is a legal device in which the courts make an interpretation about this legal device. Sometimes I agree with the courts, but sometimes I don't. And just because the courts say something, the courts say this is what the First Amendment gives you, it may very well be that the courts are wrong. And so, I don't think that we should close our minds and that, we should sort of say the conversation's over just because some court has said this is our interpretation of the First Amendment. We should determine for ourselves what we think freedom of expression should provide to us. If the courts go along with that, good for the courts. If the courts don't go along with that, then we need to, educate the courts. The courts are not, all important. The judges are not, always correct.
Well, thank you for that. I certainly want to continue to try to focus us on some of the aspects that I mentioned, the cost of free speech and how that's borne out disproportionately on certain groups. I'm wondering, Professor Kennedy, if you could talk about if there are any exceptions to the argument that you're laying out in terms of free speech and the ways in which, even though it creates all kinds of schisms in terms of racism, racial violence, there's still the need to defend it even in those situations.
Okay.
Are there exceptions to those when the realities of racial violence become so overwhelming? And when you said, if the courts don't agree, if the people emerge and say that hateful expression is costing lives, it's creating conditions in which Black men are being referred to as Black beast rapists, and that is instigating lynch mob violence, as Victor talked about. Those words are instigating lynch mob violence. It's overwhelming evidence that those hateful slurs are being used to do that. Are there exceptions in terms of our conscience, in terms of our judgment that we have to make, as you were beginning to say, where we have to suspend and use our good judgment when we see in front of us the realities?
Okay, couple things. One, we say in the United States, fortunately, there is a tremendous amount of freedom of expression. That's one of the ways in which the United States is really quite exceptional in the world. There's probably no place, no other nation state in which there is wider berth given to freedom of expression. As far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. Is it unlimited? No, it's not unlimited. So, for instance, there are laws against people threatening people. If I come up to you and threaten you, I'm using words. Is it a crime? Sure, it's a crime. I can't enter into a contract, a verbal contract, to have somebody killed. That's a crime. There are all sorts of limits on freedom of expression. I just mentioned, extortion, threats, obscenity. There are already certain limitations under which we live. If somebody comes up behind me and calls me names and just sort of throws slurs in my face directly, can that person be sanctioned by the law? Yes. Harassment, stalking, assault. So understand that the legal system already provides certain protections for us. Point one. Point two, on the question of who has benefited from the regime of freedom of expression, who has benefited? Racial minorities in particular have tremendously benefited. Our law of freedom of expression, much of the most libertarian aspects of the First Amendment, where do they come from? They come from struggles for racial justice. Every demonstration, anybody in here who goes to a demonstration, if you look at, what's the law that allows people to engage in mass dissent, you trace that law back, you go back to the 1950s and 1960s. If you take a look at the law of libel, New York Times versus Sullivan, where does that come from? That came from an effort on the part of segregationists to intimidate the New York Times. They didn't want the New York Times reporting on the horrors that were going on in the 1960s in the Deep South, the repression of Black people who were fighting for their liberation. Over and over. If you add one last, I don't want to filibuster, but one last one that's close to me. Students. What were the cases? When did students get federally protected rights under the United States Constitution? We can name a case. Dixon versus Alabama State College. Who was Dixon? Dixon was a Black student who, along with 8 other Black students, engaged in a protest. The governor of Alabama heard about it, called up Alabama State College's president and said, expel these students right now. He did. These students got lawyers. The law was against them initially. They lost at the United States District Court level, but then they appealed. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals said, these students at least have the right to a hearing. That was the beginning. And now students have a whole panoply of federally protected constitutional rights Where do they come from? They came from the struggle of Black students in the Deep South. Black people, and not only Black people, gay people, women, all marginalized peoples have benefited from the struggle for freedom of expression. And why is it so needed? Well, marginalized people, they don't have much. They don't have much to fight with other than lifting their voices, associating themselves in organizations like the NAACP. It's that has enabled them to put pressure on the powers that be. That's why marginalized people, frankly, more than anybody else, should rally around freedom of expression.
Carlos, can I ask you? Can I tell you what makes me nervous? Counterman versus Colorado. Does everyone know what Counterman versus Colorado is? It just oral arguments went forward last week. So there's a guy, I'm terrible with names, but his last name is Counterman. He sent over a 4-year span, sent 1 million, over 1 million messages to a female musician. And eventually, through Facebook. And she would tell him to stop, she would block him, and he would create a new fake account and message her. And she eventually, and it terrorized her. He would say things like, I saw you in your Jeep, or, why are you hanging out with him? I mean, it was stalking. And she eventually, on the recommendation of a friend, contacted the police. The police took it seriously. They said this was stalking. They arrested him. He'd actually served time in a federal jail for threatening his wife and his kids. And then he is now suing the state of Colorado, and this has gone up to the Supreme Court on the basis of freedom of speech, that he did not intend to harm or harass, and that that he has a mental illness, and that she should have known this, right? That he had a mental illness and wasn't serious about the 1 million 1 million messages he sent on Facebook. So that's being decided, right? Oral arguments have finished. I'm very nervous about that. The ACLU did an amicus brief on behalf of Counterman, arguing that someone randomly saying something that they didn't intend shouldn't get them in jail. And while on the face of that, I would agree, I'm not sure that 1 million Facebook messages is a random comment. The other thing that's being decided is whether you can have, whether the medium of social media makes a difference, right? In terms of it being constituted as a true threat. Because that's the other thing that Counterman wants to say, is that because it happened through the guise of social media, through Facebook, it wasn't serious. That somehow the medium of social media means him sending over 1 million messages, in which he did actually at one point say, I think you should die, which strikes me as threatening, right? Which strikes me as threatening to send that to someone.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Kennedy, before you respond, I want you to respond. I want to make sure we can get at least a few audience questions in. And I think, Kristen, you maybe have a few people who have a question.
I have a mic, so if you raise your hand, if you want to ask a question, I'll bring you the mic.
We have one in the front.
Thank you. In the context of opposing hate speech, currently there's a $25 million campaign called Stand Up to Jewish Hate, launched by Patriots owner Robert Kraft's foundation. My question is, might this form of activism serve as a useful framework to leverage for other groups victimized by hate speech as well as acts?
I don't really know much about that particular organization, but we have a person who has a belief. He is putting his money to use and trying to organize people to advance whatever, viewpoint he has. I hope it's a good viewpoint. But, people do that. And, again, in the United States, there are lots of associations. People at every level associate with one another and try to amplify their voices. A moment ago, I talked about how the racial struggle has been the seedbed of much of the best law in our civil liberties tradition. Here's another one. Where does the law of organizational privacy come from? The organizations, the Supreme Court recognizes organizational privacy. The Supreme Court recognizes that there are people who might be afraid as individuals to come forth and say something because they're afraid of maybe being ostracized, maybe they're afraid of being repressed, but they would be willing anonymously to come forward and group together and, and express a point of view. The lead case standing for the proposition of organizational privacy, NAACP versus Alabama. The state of Alabama tried to get the membership list of the NAACP in the 1950s to crush the NAACP. The Supreme Court recognized it was important for individuals to gather together, just like this individual wants to gather together. Again, an instance of the way in which minority people have the struggle for racial justice has actually led to a situation that has been for the benefit of all. It's not just for the benefit of racial minorities. These laws or these developments help out everybody, including bad people, including the Ku Klux Klan. And here's one last thing. Sometimes in these debates, I've been in discussions like this, and sometimes people say, well, the people who are mainly arguing in favor of freedom of expression, they're arguing that way because they're not on the receiving end of being called this and that. They're not on the receiving end of racial antagonism. They're not on the receiving end of the racial slurs. Well, some of the leading figures arguing for strong, capacious, muscular freedom of expression. Who are they? Thurgood Marshall. There's never been anybody on the Supreme Court of the United States who has been more passionate about the need for freedom of expression than Mr. Civil Rights Thurgood Marshall. Robert S. Carter, who was his principal lieutenant in the fight in the struggles in the 50s and 60s. Eleanor Holmes Norton. Defended. One of her clients was the Ku Klux Klan. So again, racial minority people have recognized the way in which it's very important to make sure that freedom of expression is allowed, because ultimately freedom of expression is going to be for the benefit of those who don't have other levels of power. Sometimes all you have is your voice.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Do we have at least one or two more questions for her? And I happen to know this.
I'm trying not to ask a question. I was really trying. Earlier, you mentioned that it shouldn't be the government. It shouldn't be officials making the decision on where we cut the lines. It should be us. How would you suggest we do that?
Boy, we do it through politics.
But that's the government.
Well, it's what it is. There's a way in which, we could, when I made my statement, We are the government. The government's always around us. The law is always around us. Even when we say that the law is not acting, the law is acting. The law acts through non-action. How do we, what do I mean by, it is up to us. Who are the judges? Who are the judges? At the local level, the state level, people, elect judges. At the federal level, these judges just don't fall down from Mars. They don't take a test and the best test taker gets to be put on the bench. The president selects, makes nominations. Well, who selects the president? And who selects the senators who confirmed the people who are to be the judges? They're political actors. All of this is politics. The law is politics. The law is simply the crystallization of our political inclinations. That's what the law is. It's nothing magical. It's not coming from the sky. It's not divine. We create it. And that's why it's important for us to have discussions like this, for us to sort of determine what we want, because we can get what we want. And one of the things that we're trying to figure out is actually, what do we want? Sometimes that's a very difficult thing to try to figure out.
Can I add something? Culture. So, again, the Washington Redskins were watching the Slants case, and we're thrilled to have they had their trademark restored to them. But, they would, even if this case hadn't been decided in their favor, it's not like their name would have gone away. We were just talking about a trademark, right? The federal trademark. But in 2020, they changed their name, right? They changed their name to the Washington football team without any government pressure, without any, political pressure, at least from anyone in an elected official. They changed their name because I think they recognized that there was a cultural shift in which having the name Redskins for a Major League Football team doesn't look great. And then in 2022, they changed their name to the Washington Commanders. And that was what Tam was trying to say all along, which is why he didn't want the Slants case to be tied up into the Redskins case. Is that he said it's not, he did not support the name Redskins in any way, shape, or form, or Native American disparagement. But he didn't think that his case should be used to uphold the other case. And if there's not another question, I would be curious to know what you think about the counterman. I am super nervous about this counterman decision, because I do feel like because he is trying to argue that his freedom of speech was restricted by the state of Colorado for being arrested for sending 1 million harassing messages to this woman.
Yeah. I mean,
Professor, I know you're going to give an amazing answer, and I want to give you the opportunity to do that with one of the audience questions and then answer that question for me. Thank you so much. Is there one more question that you had for us in the audience? And now I'm in trouble. Thank you. In the back.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So as our society becomes more and more polarized and less and less interested in hearing other people's perspective, what is the piece of advice that you give your students and to the society about how to come to the table differently?
I would say, just for me quickly, change your relationship to these issues, right? And the first and most important step, and maybe the only step, I told my students this today, is to really care about these issues. And then you'll figure out how to be impactful, connected to those issues. But the first thing is to learn to care about the issues. And learning to care is, and I say to them, the purpose of education, learning to care, not just learning, but learning in the interest of caring for other people is the real project of education. And so I say to them, just learn to care, right? And that'll give you all you need to do to figure out what you want to do with that. And so that would be my response, but I know my brilliant professors have other things that they tell their students.
I salute the question and you can tell from the intonation of your voice that you're very concerned. And I think you should be concerned. I certainly am concerned. I don't frankly have a good thought out response. I think that our country is really on the precipice. I've never been in these last, say, 5 to 7 years, I've never been more scared than in the past 5 to 7 years. I think we are really on the edge. And, how to get off that edge, maybe my colleague can help us. I don't really know. I know that we need to do something. I think that people need to be engaged. I think that people need to raise their voice. I think that people need to organize. They need to vote. They need to be as educated as they can be. They need to talk with their neighbors. But more particular than that, I don't want out. I do say, though, that I am very afraid for the state of our democracy. And I think that we need to do something. Maybe you can help out.
Well, I would agree with Carlos. So one of the things I do when I teach is I ask the students, what classroom environment do they want? So literally on the second day of class, I say, we're going to create a community document. And I use a Google Doc, and the students write down like the community guidelines for discussion that they want to have in the classroom. And I whittle it down to 10 things, and there's always what students want is they want to feel respected. And so then I remind them about the community guidelines, right? They have created the community guidelines. What they want is to feel respected and that their opinions get to be stated in a respectful manner. And it's not, I don't want to say it's not an issue entirely. I mean, I think I agree. I too am worried, and I'm wondering, I wonder about my grandfather in communist, before there was communist China, and what did it look like 5 years before he fled, right? And I wonder, what decision would I have to make in that case, right? So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I have a lot of faith in my students, and
Yes.
I think they're great.
Me too. Well, with that beautiful comment, I think that's going to bring us to a close. Kristen, we thank these wonderful panelists for just an amazing job of helping us understand the complexity of this issue. I certainly learned a lot, and certainly with your last comment, Professor, about the need to not just care, but to care for our students, respect our students, and then they will return the favor. So remembering that ethic of care, thank you for closing us out with that. I also want to thank PEN America. I want to thank the American Historical Association. I certainly want to thank our main sponsor, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and all our partners, certainly the Tulsa Press Club, who hosted the event, the OU Tulsa Center for Studies in Democracy and Culture, Magic City Books, and Jeff Martin, thank you. And again, to our panelists who have done just an amazing job. You will get to spend more time with them, maybe me too, if you would like. We will be doing an informal book signing in the bar area. In the back end, there will be drinks served. There's also a survey that you can fill out in response to this event. Share your feedback and share your perspectives on what you heard and what you would like to see in the future. At any rate, it's been a profound pleasure to be the moderator for this conversation. Unless there's something else for me to say, I'm going to close it out. I'm going to say amen. Thank you guys for being here. Bringing your
materials.